Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because, well, we're embarking on this really fascinating historical deep dive into the mechanics of leadership, belief, and honestly, just the human spirit. We're going to explore what I like to call the architecture of hope in impossible situations. So we'll unpack exactly how leaders construct hope when literally all the visible evidence is screaming at them to just give up. And as you'll see, this applies incredibly well to the challenges we're facing today. Everything was lost until one voice said, "Don't give up." That is just a powerful thought, right? We're dropping right into a narrative found in an ancient text, 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 17 through 22. It's the story of a leader named Judas Maccabeus stepping into a moment that feels, by every single human metric you could use, completely hopeless. His people are totally outmatched. History, if you're just looking at the statistics, well, it seems already written against them. So what do you say to people standing at the edge of collapse? Really imagine that tension for a second. This isn't about giving some pregame pep talk to a winning team. No, this is about what happens when fear is practically screaming in your ears, courage is barely a whisper, and the future looks like a completely closed door. What words can actually make a dent in a moment like that? Let's dive right into section 1, the edge of collapse, Judea under the Seleucid Empire. To really grasp the magnitude of this story, we gotta look at the intense fear and restricted identity that was brought on by a ruler named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Fun fact here, Antiochus actually called himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest, but his oppressed subjects, they called him Epimanes, the madman. This wasn't just some standard political disagreement. Their worship was restricted, their core identity was under threat, and fear was just a constant reality. We've got this stark, almost absurd contrast between the two sides. On one hand, you have the Seleucid Empire, which basically represents massive, visible power, powerful armies, endless resources, the whole shebang. On the other hand, there's Judea, functioning with incredibly limited resources and severely shaken morale. These are statistically impossible odds. It's a true David and Goliath scenario, but, on a national scale. When you have that kind of overwhelming power bearing down on you, the entire atmosphere changes. Survival itself becomes uncertain. In a climate of constant, suffocating fear like that, even the absolute smallest acts of resistance feel incredibly dangerous. People aren't thinking about thriving anymore. They're literally just desperately trying to survive the day. Moving on to section 2, a psychological and spiritual reset, refusing the final word. Right in the middle of this crushing pressure is where Judas Maccabeus rises. And it's important to note, he isn't some blind optimist, not at all. He is a realist who simply refuses to let despair have the final word. He kicks off this massive internal shift. So what does a psychological reset look like? It's the act of expanding narrowed vision away from immediate danger and back toward identity and purpose. Look, human beings are wired to survive, right? When systems fail and the pressure cranks up, we naturally narrow our vision. We fixate entirely on the danger, the loss, the limitations right in front of our faces. But Judas masterfully takes that narrowed, panicked vision and expands it right back out again. Notice this crucial shift in perspective here. He totally changes the metric of success. Instead of letting his people ask the paralyzing question, "Are we strong enough?" Because let's be honest, the answer to that was a hard no. He introduces a completely new question. Is our trust anchored in something greater than what we can see? He's reminding them that history isn't solely controlled by visible power and armies. There are invisible forces at work too. Section 3, rebuilding deliberate hope, memory as a tool of strength. You really have to remember, Judas is speaking to a group of people who have seen entirely too many losses. They've watched their friends fall. They are genuinely wondering if resistance is even worth the terrible cost anymore. For people in that kind of condition, hope doesn't just spontaneously appear. It has to be meticulously constructed. And here is the exact blueprint Judas uses to do that. Step 1, he acknowledges the overwhelming odds. He validates their reality. He's not ignoring it. Step 2, he recalls past deliverances. He reminds them of times when things looked equally impossible, but somehow shifted unexpectedly. And through that, we get to step 3. He reawakens the possibility of future survival. He takes their lived experience and their collective memory and turns it into actionable strength. Because hope must be rebuilt deliberately. What Judas is doing here isn't some fluffy, wishful thinking. It is a highly calculated refusal to let their present terrifying conditions define the ultimate outcome of their story. The fact that they've survived previous hardships, that's hard evidence that their story is not yet finished. Okay, section 4, hope as active resistance, the internal battle. This is really the hidden turning point. In the narrative of 1 Maccabeus, before any military engagement is ever described, there's this invisible internal battle that takes place first. Before a single sword is drawn, the people have to decide internally whether they're going to continue or whether they're going to just collapse. Think about the behavioral outputs of our internal beliefs. Fear is like an active contagion. It spreads quickly, it isolates individuals, it fragments communities, and honestly, it convinces people to surrender before the battle even starts. But hope unites. Hope gathers the collective spirit, and it reawakens resistance. Judas understands this dynamic perfectly. If despair wins internally, no external victory matters. Human behavior and human action strictly follow internal belief. If a group of people genuinely believes they're already defeated, well, they'll withdraw, they'll hesitate, and they will surrender. That is exactly why Judas directly attacks the internal despair first. Because fear isolates, but hope unites. When a leader speaks hope into a moment of absolute despair, it completely shifts the identity of the group. The people who were just moments ago scattered and paralyzed by anxiety suddenly begin to see themselves again as part of something much larger. And once they remember who they are together, they become significantly harder to break apart. Let's move to section 5, the timeless power of belief, bridging the ancient gap. Let's bring the timeless power of this belief right into our modern world. Because sure, the story of Judas Maccabeus is thousands of years old, but the human psychology of facing impossible situations, that hasn't changed one bit. We might not be staring down ancient armies with swords and shields, but we are absolutely facing our own overwhelming odds today. Financial pressure, sudden health crises, broken relationships, cultural uncertainty, personal failure. These modern pressures act as the exact same kind of paralyzing forces. They narrow our vision, and they make us feel like defeat is just a foregone conclusion. But just like in the Maccabean narrative, we have to remember this. Circumstances are not the final authority. When you're in the middle of a crisis, the statistics and the overwhelming odds can really feel like a final verdict. But Judas's message brilliantly challenges that assumption. He insists that the reality of the moment absolutely does not have to be the final word over your outcome. Because hope is not optimism without evidence. It's trust formed right in the middle of uncertainty. It is the conscious decision to continue when continuation no longer feels logical. And this specific definition, it's exactly what separates collapse from resistance. It offers the foundational grounding belief that even in the pitch dark, your struggle still has immense meaning. Outcomes are determined by what sustains you inside. The passage in 1 Maccabeus doesn't end with some instant resolution. Their external situation didn't just magically disappear overnight, but something internal changed. And that internal change is the true seed of future outcomes. What sustains you inside truly determines how you stand within the impossibility. So, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. What if hope itself is a form of resistance? What if faith isn't just passive waiting, but active endurance in the face of fear? Hope pushes back against finality. It keeps doors open that fear has desperately tried to close. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If this historical deep dive gave you a new perspective on facing impossible situations, make sure to subscribe so we can keep uncovering the incredible insights that history has to offer us. Keep your hope deliberate, and I'll see you next time.